So, in the tradition of how all great Christmas stories begin, once upon a time, there was a cave woman. This cave woman was not any ordinary cave woman. She was classy and sophisticated as all get out. And like all great women throughout history, she was not defined by her surroundings, but defined her surroundings. So let's call her Cave Lady. So once upon a time, there was Cave Lady. And Cave Lady lived in a cave, and outside of Cave Lady's cave, there was a plant. And it didn't take long for Cave Lady, because she's so intelligent, to realize that the life of her family and her own life depended on the life of this plant, because it provided food and therefore sustained and gave life to her family. Now, being an intelligent woman, she connected the dots on a few things. Not only was her life and the life of her family dependent on this plant, but the plant itself was dependent on forces outside of itself. She noticed that there was this ball of fire that every day would cycle through the sky. And the movement and the climate of this ball of fire would determine how healthy this plant that her family's life depended on would be. And she put some things together and realized that when this ball of fire got too hot, it would scorch the plant and it would die. And she realized that at times when it provided just the right amount of exposure to heat and the light of this ball of fire, it grew. She noticed there was this other thing. There was this water that would fall from the sky from time to time. And when it did, it caused this plant to grow. And when it got the right amount of water, it would grow. And when it got too much water, it would wash away the soil and it would damage the plant. And she'd almost be starting from scratch again. And so she realized that this plant, and therefore she, was dependent on these forces. She also, being a cave lady, had a cave husband. And cave husband, from time to time, would go, and he and some other people in his tribe would go and pursue these creatures and animals, and they'd chase them through the forest to capture them on their hunt. And sometimes they would be gone for just a few days or a few hours, and they would come back and they would have this animal to feed the family with. But there were other times when they would go and they would pursue an animal through the forest or through whatever terrain, and they would be gone for days, sometimes even weeks. And when they came back, they had almost nothing. And it was as if the animal that they had been chasing had eluded them. And they knew that their life and the prosperity of their family and their tribe depended on their ability to capture these animals. But sometimes it went well, and sometimes it just didn't go so well. Cave woman also realized something else. Cave lady observed that not only was there a ball of fire that lit up the daytime sky, but there was a ball of light that lit up the nighttime sky. And she noticed that as this day would go on, the ball of light would get thinner and thinner and thinner and thinner till it almost looked like it was about to disappear. And then all of a sudden, it would start coming back to life again. It would start getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And she noticed that that cycle with the ball of light at nighttime was directly related to 30 cycles of the same ball of fire in the daytime. And she starts to connect some dots. And then she also notices something about herself, that there is in some way something within herself, her own body, that's connected to the cycle of the moon. Watch how vague and how fast I move on from this part. She realized there's something inside her. Then, she also realized that at certain times, Cave Lady and Cave's husband would want to have a little hot and frisky roll in the hay. Literal hay, or mud, I don't know what was on the floor of the cave. And at these times, if it synced up and if it was at a right time in the cycle of the moons and the right sort of thing with her body, if it was all synced up, it would produce their activity, this new life within her, which would begin to grow and would just get bigger and bigger until all of a sudden new life came from her. And then she also noticed that this new life that came from her was dependent, and it was shallow, it was fragile. And if this new life from her didn't have this that sustains us, that it wouldn't survive. And so Cave Lady would do whatever she could. Sometimes she would put her own mouth to the mouth of the child to make sure that it had the breath, that it had the life force flowing through it, that it needed to be sustained. She realized that she is dependent on forces beyond her control. She is dependent on these forces, these things that she can't quite control, but she knows she needs them. Now, over a course of thousands of years, people begin to personalize these forces. They begin to give them names. They call them things. They start to use the word gods. And sometimes they give them names and they give them stories. And they personalize and they personify them. Because as they understood it, these forces must be controlled by a personality outside of us. And if the rains aren't falling, it must be because there's an entity beyond what we can understand or see, and he's got a bucket of water, and he's using his bucket of water, and he's pouring it out somewhere else, and if we get lucky enough, he'll pour his bucket of water out on us. And the same with the night, and the same with the moon, and the same with the sun, the wind, and they started to name all of these things and give them personalities. And then, not alone that, but because they knew that their lives were dependent on these forces outside their control, they wanted to earn their favor. If there's some entity beyond my control, I want it to favor me. I want it to do what I need it to do so that I can sustain life in the life of my village and the life of my family. And so this tradition arose where people would take some of what they had, some of what the forces, the gods, helped them to get, and they would give it back. So you would have somebody who perhaps grew some crops. And if he had a good yield that year, he would take some of his crops and say, okay, as a sign of gratitude because I want the gods to favor me, I'm going to give some of what I have, some of my crop, to the God as a way of saying thank you, as a way of appeasing them, as a way of getting them on my side. Or if I had a flock, I would give one of my animals. Or if I had a vineyard, I would give some of my yield over to the gods. And so, because the gods were and the forces were up here, this tradition arose where people would take what it was they had to offer, what they had to sacrifice in honor of the gods, and they would put it on this thing that became an icon of human history, an altar. And so they would take this thing and they would say, God, I wouldn't be so foolish to think that I could sustain my life on my own. I wouldn't be so foolish to think that I can live without your favor. So I'm going to give you back some of what it is that I have. Now, different regions of the world developed these different stories, these different narratives about the gods. They had different names for their gods. You had regions of the world where El was the god, or in Egypt, one of the gods was Ra, or you had Baal, the Canaanite god, or you had Marduk, or you had the Greek gods like Zeus and Apollos. And they all had stories and personalities. And all of these priests started to pop up who told you, here's what to do to please this God. And you had rituals. And somebody might even say to you if you were experiencing a problem, hey, you're experiencing some infertility. Here's what you need to do. There's a region, there's a city over here. And that region, that city has a God. And that God is the God of fertility. And if you go there and you take part of your yield, part of your flock, and if you do just the right thing, then you'll earn the favor of this God, and it might change things for you. And so all of a sudden, these rituals start appearing where people find ways to earn the favor of their gods. And all these different regions have different names, and they have different stories, and they have different temples and altars all over the place for these different gods in order to earn their favor. Now, there's a fundamental flaw, though, in this whole system, because how much do you give to the God? If you have a particularly good crop one year, and you think, well, last year I gave X amount as an offering to the God, well, what do I give this year? Because I don't want to offend the God by not giving them more than what I gave them last year, seeing as I got more crop this year, so perhaps I need to give more. And then what happens the next year? Well, maybe I need to give more. Maybe I need to give extra animals from my flock. Maybe I have to give extra from my vineyard. Maybe I have to do more. And the cycle goes on and on and on. And it's like, well, if I had a bad year, then maybe the God is angry at me. Maybe I offended them. Maybe I did something to suggest that I'm not grateful. And so maybe what I need to do is I need to give extra because it's not been a good year for me. And so you give extra. But then what happens if you have a particularly good year and you're thinking, well, do I have to give extra for this year? And so it starts this vicious cycle where the more you give, the more you feel you have to give, the more you feel you have to give. And then whether it's a good year or a bad year, you find you're giving more and more and more, and you never know how much. Which led to one of the fundamental questions that defined all of humanity throughout human history. This is one of the innate questions that human beings wrestled with and asked themselves. Where do I stand with the gods? Where do I stand with the gods? Are they happy with me? Are they angry at me? Are they pleased with me? Have I done enough to earn their favor? What is it going to take? Where do I stand with the gods? Which created within humanity this deep anxiety, because you never quite knew if the gods were in your favor or if things were going to turn out the way you wanted them to. And so at that point, well, what is there left to give? When you've given every part of your crop that you have to give, what's next? And so you have some traditions, like Baal or Baal, the Canaanite god, where the priests and the priestesses would work themselves into a frenzy in order to worship this god. And as an act of devotion, they would cut themselves with knives and stones. And they would cut themselves and say, look how devoted I am to you. Look, here's my act of worship. I'm actually going to harm myself just to convince you that I'm devoted to you. Then you had other gods from other regions. And there's one in modern, what we know as modern day Turkey, but at that time was called Sardis. There was a god which was the mother, the goddess of motherhood. And at one time, there were about 5,000 priests who castrated themselves to show their devotion to this god. Crazy stuff. Then you had gods like Molech. Molech was what was known as the detestable god, because for Molech, he could never get enough. He could never get enough of what it was you had to make him happy. And so people ended up developing a tradition that said that Molech demanded from you your own children, and that in order to please him, you had to take your child and sacrifice him in the fire in the valley of Hinnom. And this vicious cycle just never went away, and people never knew where they stood with the gods, and it just got crazier and crazier and crazier. Now, we like to think that we modern people are so much more evolved than those ancient primitive people. But if we're really honest with ourselves, we have gods of our own. How many of you, even this Christmas season, have noticed how devoted you are to the god of wealth? Maybe Christmas has reminded you of how much more you need that God's favor because you just don't make enough money. And there's just more stuff that you want, and you're willing to do whatever it takes to get the favor of this God to shine on you. Some of you at this Christmas season, you're reminded, because of maybe a sense of loneliness or a sense of isolation, that the God of romance has not smiled on you. And you would be willing to do whatever it takes. And you're thinking, why can't the God of romance, why can't Cupid come into the 21st century and get a bazooka instead of this arrow? It's so primitive. Like, I need something. I need more ammo. Like, it's going to take more. Why can't he just nuke everybody in my favor, right? Just whatever it takes. That would be fantastic. For some of you, you got on Tinder and you said a prayer that the swipes would be forever in your favor. May the swipes be right? Sometimes we find that the God that we're devoted to is an idealism, how we expected things to be, how we expected our family to be. And at Christmas, we're reminded of just how unideal they are, just how imperfect and flawed they are, or just how much our life didn't get to the place where we want it to be. But whatever it takes to get there, we're willing to do it. And we expend energy and time, and we give things, and we sacrifice from other parts of our lives in order to please and to win the favor of the gods that we worship. So in reality, we're not all that much more evolved. But then in the story, it takes this huge leap forward. There's this gigantic leap forward in the story where there's this tribe of people called the Hebrews. And the Hebrews are unique because they had just one God. So instead of having many gods, they had one God known as monotheism. And their God was called Yahweh. Yahweh. Close relative of Yas, queen. Mortal enemy of Noe. So Yahweh was their God. And one of the things that made Yahweh unique in their tradition was they believed that Yahweh, their God, gave them a system. He gave them laws. He gave them rituals to know how to be in good standing with Yahweh. So if you've ever read any of the Bible, or if you ever went to Sunday school, you may have heard the stories in Genesis about how this God created the world, and how, and it talks about the foundation stories of this God, Yahweh. And then it goes Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, which is where everyone stops. And if you've ever done one of those plans where you're like, I'm going to read the Bible all the way through in a year, you didn't get past Leviticus. Don't tell a lie. If you got anywhere past that, you skipped it. Because this book, Leviticus, details how the Hebrew people believed that their God gave them this system. He gave them this law through their prophet Moses. He wrote down exactly in specific, meticulous, ritual detail exactly what you have to do to please him. And so the book is so freaking boring. It's like, here is exactly what you have to do if you have committed this sin. And at this time of year, you must offer this exact sacrifice. And your priest must be wearing this type of fabric. And you must live this kind of way. And don't dare do this. And you must wash yourself this many times in this river with this type of water. And just detail after detail after detail, which to our modern minds sounds crazy. But what was so revolutionary about this was you didn't have to wonder anymore. See, with the Hebrews' God, you didn't have to wonder how to please him. Now you knew how. Now you could know how to be in good standing with this God. And so, all of a sudden, a group of people had a way to assuage the guilt that they felt for anything that they had done wrong that might have offended their God, or to assuage the guilt that they may have felt about anything they did wrong to each other. So when they would steal from each other, when they would offend each other, they had a way that they could deal with that guilt. They had a way that they could decrease the anxiety of wondering where I stood with God. There was a way to de-escalate the excess. There was a way to decelerate the vicious cycle that tended to go round and round. And so it's this giant leap in human consciousness to think there is actually a way to know where I stand with God. Amazing. But this culture didn't exist in isolation. And I think for some of us, when we think of the Bible, especially those older things, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, we think it's as if they were written somewhere over here outside of time and space. But the truth is that these things were written by real people in history, in time and space, in a specific cultural and historical context. And their culture and their history evolved. And so as their culture evolves, disagreements start to arise about how do you interpret these laws? How do you properly fulfill the system when your world is evolving so fast, when your culture is changing, when you're experiencing modernity? So how do you answer, how do you keep ancient laws in a modern context? And I know we think of them as ancient people, but at one time they were modern people. And they were trying to interpret a law that was an ancient law in a modern time, and times had changed. So how do you fully and completely fulfill the law? So people started disagreeing, and they started arguing with each other about it. And even to the point where certain people had different interpretations of how you properly, in every different situation, fulfill the law or properly practice the system. And they would do so even at the expense of somebody else, which felt like it was kind of getting away from the heart of the whole thing. That you might keep the law, but you would do it at the expense of somebody else's well-being. And all of a sudden, a system that was very effective over time becomes less and less and less effective. So you're back to the same question. Where do I stand with the gods? Or in their context, where do I stand with God? Which is a question that probably every one of us at some point in our lives, whether we identify as Christian, atheist, agnostic, not sure, whatever, at some point we may have asked this question. And it may have been, if there is a God, if a God exists somewhere out there, how do I know where I stand with her or him or it or them? How could I possibly know? How can I assuage the guilt that I might feel? How can I de-escalate the vicious cycle in my life? How can I try and decrease the anxiety of not knowing quite, how do I know where I stand with God, if there even is a God, and if that's a possibility that it might exist? Which is where Christmas comes in. Because onto the scene of human history steps a baby. And this baby is born to this woman called Mary, and Mary calls this baby Jesus, and he grows up. He's a carpenter or a builder of some kind, and when he's about 30 years of age, he launches into a public career of ministry that lasts, somewhere between 1 year and 3 years, and he's so unique. People follow him from everywhere. People are attracted to the things he says and he does, because here comes this guy, and he starts a whole movement, and the movement goes like this. The old system that you guys followed, that's ending. The old system, the old way of doing things, the old way that you could try and tell where you stood with God, that's over. And I'm here to start something entirely brand new. The old system is finished. And he said things like this. He would say, I didn't come to abolish the law. I didn't come to get rid of the system. I actually came to fulfill it. I came to fulfill it so that it's no longer necessary anymore. And all of a sudden we see that this new movement, this brand new thing that Jesus is starting, centers around himself. So the old system is gone and something brand new is starting, but it's all about me. And this message was so revolutionary, so incredibly threatening to the powers that be at the time, that as many of us know the story of Jesus, and if you're familiar with Easter, the story goes that the powers that be didn't like this revolutionary story, and so they crucified Jesus. And it seemed like the whole movement was dead. But then the followers of Jesus said that even though they thought the whole thing was over, even though they thought it was lights out, after 3 days, they say Jesus is raised by God from the dead. And that he comes back. And all of a sudden, a movement that seemed dead suddenly gets an explosion of new life. And this new movement that Jesus started starts to spread all over the world. It's like absolutely contagious, just goes everywhere and starts to topple the powers that once tried to suppress it. It's this amazing story. And the first Christians, as they tried to find language to explain what it was that they had experienced, as they tried to explain what happened in these events of Jesus and this new movement, but then his death and his resurrection, how do we find meaning for it? What did it mean? And not just for the whole, not just for themselves, but for the whole world, because according to them, they felt like this new movement had cosmic significance. Like these events of Jesus' death and resurrection meant something not just for them individually, but for all people at all times. And so one of the very first Christians records his thoughts, tries to find a way to describe the events that he experienced, and here's what he writes down. He says this. He says, so in the beginning was the Word, which is a really fascinating word, because when this verse was written, it was written in the original language of Greek. And the Greek word for this word is logos. And logos is a big word, it's a really important word, but essentially logos is the life force that animates the universe. It's the life force that animates and gives life to, sustains and maintains every bit of life. And so this writer says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. This life force that existed wasn't just with God, but it was the very essence of God. And he was with God in the beginning, he continues. And through him, through this logos, and now all of a sudden he's hinting at something that Christians believe. All of a sudden he's doing what people did a long, long time ago. He starts to personify this force. It's not just a life force that animates the universe, it's a him. Through him, all things were made. Without him, nothing was made that has been made. In him was that thing that sustains and gives life to everything else. And that life was the light of all humankind. And then Then he drops the bomb, and I'm sure that the early Christians who were reading this probably were like, what's he going to say? Wait. Is he talking about what I think he's talking about? Is he talking about the same experience that we feel like we've experienced? Is he about to say what we think he's saying? And he says, yeah. See, in the pages of human history, Christmas was so unique because the life force, the Logos, the word that sustains the world, that gives life to everything else that has life, the word became flesh, came down as a baby, as one of us, as human, stepped down into our world, into our experience, and made his dwelling among us. Or as it would have said and sounded in the common vernacular, it's like he came and pitched a tent right in the middle of us. And all of a sudden, it wasn't just the forces, it wasn't just the gods that we offer something to, it wasn't even a system anymore. Now it was a person. It was flesh and blood. It was a personality. It was humanity. Just like you and me. That the God who created the universe and sustains it stepped into our shoes, right into the middle of our story, and said, you don't have to wonder where you stand with me anymore. Because for all of human history, the biggest question was, where do we stand with the gods? Where do we stand with the gods? Have we earned their favor? Have we done things right? Is there something I can do to earn their trust or earn their affection? What do I have to do? Where do we stand with the gods? And Christmas reminds us that all of that has changed, because no longer is the question, where do we stand with the gods? Because the answer is that God stands with us. God stands with us. You don't have to wonder where you stand with God. It is possible to know exactly where God stands. It's with you, and you with him. That God stepped into your story and actually advocates on your behalf. At Christmas time, we hear this word, and it's in tons of our songs and tons of our Christmas carols. Hear this word, Emmanuel. Some of you might be like, well, what does that word mean? What does that word mean? And it simply means God is with us. God is with us, which is why we use this word when we talk about Jesus. In fact, during this time in history, when people were debating, how do we keep the law properly? How do we make sure we're keeping the system exactly as it's meant to be kept? And they started to harm other people at the expense of their own interpretation of the law. This tradition of prophets rose up who started to call people back and say, listen, God hates your debates. God hates your sacrifices. They've become, as some of the prophets described it, like an odor, like a stink in God's nostrils, that you think that you can please him even though you hurt other people. And the prophets call back people to justice and mercy and love. And this, for the very first time in human history, the prophets start this line that says, actually, God loves us. God actually cares and wants you to care for other people. And then they start saying things like this: there's going to be somebody who's going to bring us back. There's going to be somebody who comes and brings us back to that reality that God loves us, that God wants and cares about how we treat each other. And some of them say, there's going to be this person who's going to come, and we're going to call him Emmanuel, which means God with us. And I don't even think they knew what they were saying when they said it. I think it was so much bigger and more poetic than they ever could have imagined that it would be in real life. And then onto the pages of history steps Jesus, God with us. See, as the first Christians understood it, they saw Jesus' death, and they're trying to explain it because it's such a confusing thing. They think that there's this movement that started, and all of a sudden it seems like the movement is over. And then there's the resurrection, and they're like, what did this mean? And so they're trying to interpret and trying to understand what this event meant in light of what had come before. And a tradition arose where the Christians, the first Christians, they began to speak of Jesus' death as the full and final sacrifice of the system. To say, like, you know what? There doesn't need to be any more sacrifices. We understand Jesus' death as the last one of those. There's a portion in the New Testament, one of the writers, he writes a book called Hebrews, the name of that tribe. So he's writing a letter to a bunch of Hebrew people, and he says, look, here's the deal. There was no possible way that the blood of bulls and goats, all these sacrifices, this violent, bloody system that we had of trying to please God, there's no way that could ever have pleased God. All it did was just try and cover our conscience. It just tried to appease our own conscience and help us feel not guilty. And in fact, every time we had to bring a sacrifice to fulfill the system, it just reminded us of how guilty we were. But Jesus, through his death, means you don't have to do that anymore. That whole system is over. Now you don't have to wonder what to do to figure out where you stand with God. Jesus has already sorted that out. Now God stands with us. And God moved from what had been in all human history an entity beyond us, above us, that may or may not be angry with us, to a God who was with us and amongst us and for us. And now you don't have to wonder where you stand with your gods anymore, because we all have them. And we're all sacrificing for them. We're all sacrificing to the God of success. We're all clamoring to get the God of approval or the God of romance or the God of idealism to be in our favor so that things work out the way that we want them to. And the story of Christmas says, you don't have to do that anymore. You don't have to strive. You don't have to sacrifice things. How much more are you going to give to try and please the gods in your life? How much of your time and your energy and your money are you going to sacrifice for these gods? How much are you going to harm yourself in order to win the approval of others? How many relationships are you going to sacrifice before you feel like you've had enough success? How much more are you going to have to give your energy until you feel like it's enough? The story of Christmas reminds us, you don't have to do that anymore. You don't have to live that way. You don't have to live like that. Because for some of us, Christmas time is a really hard time because it amplifies, like we said, it amplifies those hard times in our life. And some of us, we're just medicating, right? We're medicating with substances to try and numb some of the emotions that we're feeling. And you know, of course, we're only doing it because it's Christmas and it's a party, but really, if you're honest with yourself, it's an act of devotion to the gods to try and assuage some guilt, to try and de-escalate the anxiety. And Christmas says you don't have to do that anymore. You don't have to live that way anymore. You don't have to worry. You don't have to wonder. God stands with us. And that is good news. Let me pray for us. Heavenly Father, I feel like every single one of us in this room relate to that story in some way. Whether or not we even realize that this is what we've been doing, this has been the pattern in our lives. Like we're all chasing approval. We're all chasing something. We're all trying to relieve our guilt, or we're all trying to achieve what we want through some means. And that's frustrating. And it's exhausting us. And for some of us, it's costing our relationships. It's causing us our mental health. It's costing us finances. It's costing us our time and our energy, and we're just not willing to do it anymore. God, thank you for what you've done. That through Jesus, God is not some entity off in the sky in heaven, but that heaven, through Jesus, is a present reality amongst us, with us, for us. Thanks for clearing up the confusion, for ending that system that we could never, ever get right. God, even if we don't believe it, even if there's some of us here tonight, and we're like, I just don't believe that that's true. I just don't think it's factual. But we know it moves something in us. We know that there's some reason why we hear that and go, yeah, that sounds really good. God, would you help remind us we don't have to live like that anymore. Heaven is not a distant place. It's a present reality with us, amongst us, through Jesus. And it's in his name that we pray.